Hey guys, how's it going? So if you've been following the channel for a while, then you'll probably know that Luke is my favorite character in all of Star Wars and he is my hero. So I wanted to make this compilation of all of the lore videos that I've made about Luke. So if you love Luke or just lore in general about Star Wars, then this video is for you. I hope you enjoy it. Luke Skywalker was one of the most powerful Force users of all time, becoming a great Jedi Master after the Galactic Civil War. In the years following the Battle of Endor, Luke aided the fledgling New Republic in maintaining order across the galaxy and defeating Imperial remnants. Luke faced many battles, such as the resurgence of Grand Admiral Thrawn and his clash with the insane Dark Jedi clone Joruus C'baoth. After that, the resurrected Emperor Palpatine returned to the galaxy, forcing Luke to temporarily fall to the dark side in an attempt to destroy the darkness from within. After being redeemed by his friends, Luke formed the new Jedi Order in 11 ABY, establishing his Jedi Praxium on Yavin 4. Over the next several decades, Luke would study the power of the Force, growing stronger as he endured many conflicts like the Black Fleet Crisis, the Almanian Uprising, and the Yuuzhan Vong War, and eventually taking the title of Grand Master in 36 ABY. I want to examine Luke's Force powers across his lifetime, from his earliest training with Obi-Wan to his abilities as the master of his new Jedi Order. Inheriting immense strength in the Force from his father, Luke actually had the potential to rival Anakin, meaning that he had the ability to become what his father could have had he never been injured on Mustafar. Luke was gifted with the full Force potential of the Chosen One, which at his peak would have made him essentially a godlike being. Even when he was barely trained, Luke displayed remarkable strength in the Force, using its power to guide the proton torpedoes to destroy the first Death Star. 3 years later, he was able to build his own lightsaber using instructions left behind by Obi-Wan, successfully forming a synthetic crystal and aligning the components of the hilt. In later years, Luke became incredibly strong in more personal applications of the Force's power. After he was fatally wounded in a battle between the Singing Mountain clan and the Night Sisters, he was able to completely heal himself with the Force over the span of a few hours. He was proficient enough in Force speed that he could increase the speed of his lightsaber strikes to the point that time seemed to be in slow motion, and he felt as though the Force guided his movements in combat. Luke was also very skilled in telekinesis. During a food fight inside the Jedi Praxium, he was able to freeze every single piece and drop of food or drink in midair all at once, with everything only dropping once he consciously released it. Luke was also able to telekinetically absorb the blasts of an AT-AT's ion cannons, before destroying it with only the Force. In perhaps his greatest feat of telekinesis, Luke sustained and moved an artificial black hole with the Force during the Battle of Dantooine. Luke also mastered several rare and difficult Force abilities during his time forming the new Jedi Order. While searching for his first Jedi students, he was able to walk on lava and battle a fireworm simultaneously. Luke also trained to overcome the Force blindness that was caused by the Ysalamiri, a species that created bubbles within the Force as an adaptation against predators. In one of the greatest fights of his life, Luke was able to enter a plane within the Force known as Beyond Shadows, existing outside of time or space, and he used his power in the Force to defeat Abeloth with the help of Darth Krayt. In perhaps one of his most insanely powerful feats, during the Battle of Yuuzhan, Luke was able to consciously reach a state of oneness within the Force. While this state was usually reserved for those who had died and passed into the netherworld of the Force, Luke was able to enter this state at will, becoming an extension of the Force itself. He became a storm of luminous Force energy, exceeding physical existence in the battle. To those watching the battle, it looked as though Luke was a blur of 20 lightsabers engaging his enemies. Luke was also able to call upon the power of the light side, using his love for his son Ben and wife Mara Jade until the full power of the light side of the Force rushed into him, causing his cells to burst with power and his skin to glow. Luke used this ability in one of his confrontations with Abeloth. It's also worth noting that after Luke returned from the dark side of the Force, he realized that he was more powerful than he had ever been because he respected and understood the dangers of the dark side. Okay, so as you guys can tell, Luke's Force powers in Legends are absolutely insane. I can't even cover them all, so just consider these to be like the greatest hits. He was pretty overpowered, but only because he was the son of the Chosen One and he actually inherited Anakin's potential in the Force. So in the Legends books, basically across 30 years worth of stories and 100 or 2 books, Luke became more powerful than Anakin ever was. This is why most people will refer to Luke as the most powerful Force user of all time. And while that's never been explicitly stated that he is the most powerful Force user of all time, it's pretty much left up to opinion. George Lucas stated himself that Luke had the potential to become what Anakin never could, so it's up to you. Luke is absolutely one of the most powerful Force users for sure, but he could also very well be the most powerful of all time. When Luke Skywalker surrendered to Imperial forces on Endor in an attempt to confront and redeem Darth Vader, he was also forced to confront the reigning Sith Master, Emperor Palpatine, also known as Darth Sidious. Luke had been warned by Yoda not to underestimate the Emperor, and this final clash between Jedi and Sith served as Luke's ultimate trial on his journey to become a Jedi Knight. In the novelization of Return of the Jedi, Luke's thoughts during the entire ordeal are fleshed out, really showing how he was incredibly conflicted and his mind rapidly fluctuated between the light and dark sides of the Force in the face of evil. As the elevator doors opened and Luke stepped into the large throne room, his mind buzzed with what to do. He was being taken to the Emperor. He knew that if he could just keep his mind clear, he could see what must be done and do it. A great noise filled his head, like an underground wind. He hoped that Han and Leia deactivated the deflector shield quickly and destroyed the Death Star while all 3 of them were on it. Luke would gladly accept his own death if it meant destroying Vader and the Emperor too. The closer Luke came to the Emperor, the more uncertain he became about what would happen, and he feared the dark possibilities of the immediate future. A black storm raged inside him. He wanted to kill the Emperor, but then what? Confront Vader again? What would his father do? And what if Luke faced his father first and destroyed him? The thought was simultaneously repugnant and compelling. For the first time, Luke saw a brief, murky image of himself standing over his father's dead body, absorbing his father's power, and sitting at the Emperor's side. He squeezed his eyes shut against the thought, but it left a cold sweat on his brow, as if death's hand had brushed him there and left a shallow imprint. Luke and Vader stood before Palpatine side by side, as father and son, both dressed in black, one masked and the other exposed. As the Emperor welcomed him, Luke stared back at the hooded figure defiantly. Suddenly, Luke's shackles fell away, and he thought of how his hands were now free to reach out and crush the Emperor's windpipe in an instant, but he didn't. He was confused as to why the Emperor seemed gentle and had just let him free, but he knew that Palpatine was also devious and not to be trusted. The Emperor was unarmed. Luke knew that he could still strike, but wasn't aggression part of the dark side? Mustn't he avoid it at all costs? Or could he use the darkness judiciously and then put it away? He stared at his free hands. He could end it all right there. He had total freedom to choose what to do now, yet he could not choose. He could kill Palpatine, or he could succumb to Palpatine's arguments. He could kill Vader, and then he could even become Vader. Again, he pushed that thought into the back corner of his mind. The Emperor sat before him, smiling. The moment was convulsive with possibilities, yet it passed and Luke did nothing. As Palpatine began to speak, Luke remained silent, intent on revealing nothing. At the mention of Obi-Wan's name and his failure to train Anakin Skywalker, Luke tensed with fury, yet he also knew that the Emperor was partly right. He tried to bring his anger under control since it seemed to please the Dark Lord. Palpatine indeed took notice of Luke's emotions and continued to speak of Obi-Wan, this time about his death at Vader's hand, as Luke struggled to regain his composure. The Emperor wanted to know who had continued Luke's training, and he was able to sense that it had been Master Yoda, causing Luke to flush with anger towards himself for revealing so much unwittingly. Luke strove to be calm, to follow Obi-Wan and Yoda's teachings. He filled his mind with a serene nothingness, striving to let the Emperor's words wash over him as he simply remained. Palpatine remarked that Yoda must have taught Luke to wield the Force with great skill, and in that moment the young Jedi sensed something he hadn't noticed before in the Emperor. Fear. It was fear of Luke himself, fear that his power could be turned against the Emperor. Luke saw this fear inside Palpatine and felt that the odds had shifted slightly, and with sudden absolute calm, Luke stood upright. He remained calm until a few moments later, as the Emperor forced him to watch the rebel fleet walk into an ambush. Luke's eyes darted from Palpatine to Vader and finally to his lightsaber. His mind quivered with alternatives, as suddenly everything was out of control again. He could count on nothing but himself, and on himself his hold was tenuous. The situation was degenerating fast from Luke's perspective. Defeat after defeat was being piled on his head. How much could he take? There seemed to be no end to the deeds Palpatine could carry out against the galaxy. Slowly, Luke raised his hand in the direction of his lightsaber. As the Emperor continued to mock the rebel fleet, Luke was in torment, raising his hand further. He realized that both Palpatine and Vader were watching him. He lowered his hand, lowered his level of anger, trying to restore his previous calm and see what he needed to do. As the Emperor goaded him, insisting that Luke strike him down and give in to his anger, Luke tried to hide his agony, thinking of Obi-Wan and Yoda. He wondered if, since both of his masters were now part of the Force, they could somehow distort Palpatine's vision with their presence. Luke thought that if there was ever a moment he needed Obi-Wan's guidance, it was now, and he had never felt so lost. Luke watched in horror as the laser beam of the Death Star vaporized one of the rebel star cruisers. In the numbing grip of despair, with the hollowest of voids devouring his heart, Luke's eyes again drifted to his lightsaber. In that moment, the dark side was with him. He continued his spiral into desperation as the Death Star laser continued its assault on the rebel fleet. Luke's face contorted along with his spirit as Vader and the Emperor watched him closely, and his lightsaber began to tremble on its resting place. As Palpatine laughed and again instructed him to strike him down, Luke could resist the darkness no longer. His lightsaber rattled violently and flew into his hand, impelled by the Force. He ignited it and swung it with his full weight downward at the Emperor's skull. In that same instant, Vader's blade flashed into view, parrying Luke's attack. The Emperor watched, the sole audience to the dire contest as Luke and Vader faced each other. Luke attacked aggressively, actually managing to send Vader tumbling down the stairs. As he stood over his father, Luke knew that the duel was in his hands now. He could kill Vader. He could even take Vader's place at the Emperor's side. Luke didn't bury the thought this time, he gloried in it. He engorged himself with its juices, felt its power tingle his cheeks. It made him feverish, this thought, with lust so overpowering as to totally obliterate all other considerations. He had the power and the choice was his. And then another thought slowly emerged. He could destroy the Emperor too. Destroy them both and rule the galaxy, avenge and conquer. It was a profound moment for Luke, dizzying, yet he did not recoil from it. As the Emperor encouraged him, Luke faltered, realizing what was happening. He was confused again, wondering what he wanted and what he should do. His brief moment of dark clarity was now gone in a wash of indecision. He took a step back and tried to drive the hatred from his being. Vader attacked, but Luke disengaged and retreated to the safety of an overhead walkway, insisting that he would not fight. Though Vader denied any internal conflict, Luke could feel it. He realized that Vader had had the opportunity to kill him twice before, over the first Death Star and later on Bespin, yet he had not. Luke knew that there was still good in his father. Vader threw his saber, slicing the supports and sending Luke tumbling to the lower level beneath the main platform. As Luke hid within the shadows, he knew that this might be his end. If it was, so be it. He would not use darkness to fight darkness. Perhaps the fight of the Jedi and the rebellion would be left to Leia, to carry on without him. Perhaps she would know a way that he didn't know. Perhaps she could find a path. For now, Luke could only see two paths. One was into darkness, and one was not. As Vader prowled nearby, he sensed Luke's thoughts, causing the young Jedi to try and hide his feelings. Luke could feel Leia's pain as she was wounded down on the surface of Endor, and he could not hide that shared feeling from his mind, as Vader's consciousness invaded that private bond. With the revelation that Luke had a sister, Vader declared that he would turn Leia to the dark side if Luke refused. That was Luke's breaking point, for Leia was everyone's last hope. Luke screamed, rushing at his father with a fury he'd never known before. In a frenzy, he battled Vader fiercely, and it was evident that the advantage was all his. Luke pushed Vader back, forcing the Dark Lord to retreat onto the bridge above the power core. Finally, with a brutal blow, he severed Vader's right hand at the wrist. Luke stared at his father's broken mechanical hand, and then at his own gloved hand, and realized suddenly just how much he'd become like his father, like the man he hated. Trembling, he stood above Vader, and he wanted to destroy this being of darkness, this thing that was once his father, that was once him. Suddenly, the Emperor was near, encouraging Luke to finish it. Luke stared at his father again, and he realized that it was the darkness that he hated. Not his father, not even the Emperor, but the darkness inside of them. In them and in himself. And the only way to destroy darkness was to renounce it, for good and all. Luke stood suddenly, and made the decision for which he'd spent his life in preparation. He hurled his lightsaber away, declaring that he would never turn to the dark side, that he was a Jedi, like his father before him. This is one of my favorite moments in all of Star Wars because you guys know that Luke is my favorite character. This is the moment that he became a Jedi, and the novelization does an amazing job of explaining his thoughts as he went back and forth between the light and dark sides. Raised in hiding and ignorant of his true heritage and the history of his family, Luke Skywalker still knew very little about his father after the events of Return of the Jedi. While Luke didn't blame Anakin for his actions during his time as Darth Vader, Leia did, and Luke wished that she could see things as he did. Although he attempted to discuss Anakin with Leia several times and expressed his desire to learn about his father's past, Leia refused. The story of Luke investigating Anakin's origins and the history of his family is told in the Legends book A New Hope: The Life of Luke Skywalker. Luke explained to Leia that he felt compelled to learn about Anakin's life so that he could understand how he became the man he was, and how certain circumstances of Anakin's life might have affected his decisions. Luke knew that he couldn't learn from his father's mistakes if he didn't know what they were, and by learning about the past, he would be better prepared for the future. Luke took to researching the HoloNet for any and all data about the Jedi Order. Unfortunately, most of the information he found was merely old Imperial propaganda. The Empire's leaders still claimed that the Jedi Knights who had served the Republic during the Clone Wars had been secretly plotting to overthrow the Republic and conquer the galaxy. Luke knew that the data was lies, and that it was the Emperor who had manipulated events to bring down the Jedi Order and fulfill his own ambitions. Luke didn't expect to find any data about Obi-Wan, Yoda, or Anakin. He'd searched the HoloNet before and had only come up empty. However, this time he found something. Luke could hardly believe his eyes when he discovered his father's name in an article that was recently posted by a former pod racer named Clegg Holdfast. Although pod racing remained illegal throughout the galaxy, the destruction of the second Death Star had apparently emboldened Holdfast to write about the outlawed sport. Holdfast's article was a history of the Boonta Eve Classic, a once famous pod race competition that had been held annually at the Mos Espa Arena on Tatooine. The article provided a list of Boonta winners and other participants. According to the data, Anakin Skywalker's victory had occurred 36 years earlier. Luke studied the article with amazement. After the conflicting accounts he'd heard from his uncle and aunt as well as Obi-Wan, he'd begun to wonder whether his father had ever been on Tatooine at all. Now it appeared he had proof. He navigated through the article and found a holographic image and schematics of Anakin's pod racer. Unfortunately, Holdfast had not provided any images of Anakin himself. Luke scanned through the article, learning that the Mos Espa Arena had become a track for swoop bike races, and 2 veteran pilots of the Boonta were currently employed as mechanics. Luke decided right then that he was overdue for a vacation. As he returned to his homeworld of Tatooine, Luke remembered how he had told Obi-Wan that he would never return, yet he had several times. He landed his X-Wing on the roof of the Mos Espa Grand Arena, and he made his way to the 2 mechanics he was looking for, Odi Mandrell and Teemto Pagales. From them, Luke learned as much information about Anakin's role in pod racing as he could. They recalled how Anakin was only 9 when he had won the Boonta, how he was a speed demon, and he never cheated in a race. Luke asked if they knew where Anakin had lived, and they directed him to Mos Espa, instructing him to visit Watto's junk shop, which was now owned by Anakin's childhood friend, Wald. As Luke made his way to Wald's shop in Mos Espa, he was confused by R2's insistence about accompanying him. Inside the shop, Luke thought of how much he would have loved this place in his youth, filled with metal scrap and odd bits of machinery. Meeting Wald, Luke said that he was looking to find out information on Anakin Skywalker. From Wald, Luke would learn the shocking truth of Anakin's life on Tatooine, and how he had not only won the Boonta Eve, but won his freedom as well. Wald told Luke how Anakin and his mother Shmi were once Watto's slaves, and how Anakin had left Tatooine with a Jedi Knight. Wald told Luke how Shmi had stayed behind and remained a slave after Anakin left. Wald said that Shmi had looked out for him after that, and had been sold and married to the farmer Klieg Lars, and that he had even attended their wedding in Anchorhead. At hearing all of this information about his grandmother, Luke's memory flashed to the unmarked graves on the Lars homestead, where he knew that she rested. Wald mentioned how awful the circumstances of Shmi's death was, and informed Luke how she had been abducted and killed by Tusken Raiders. Luke's knees felt weak, and he steadied himself on R2, before abruptly telling Wald that he had to go. The air outside was even hotter than in the shop, but Luke took a deep breath anyway. He had spent so many years wondering about the life of Anakin Skywalker and had been so excited when he discovered that his father had been a pod racer pilot on Tatooine. Now he just felt drained and exhausted. He thought of how awful it was that his father and grandmother were once slaves. And then he felt outraged. Not just because of the injustice of Anakin and Shmi's lives, but because Owen and Beru had never told him. But then he wondered if Owen and Beru even knew that Shmi was once a slave. He also realized that Obi-Wan must have known. Yet Luke realized that he wasn't angry with Owen, Beru, or Obi-Wan. He knew in his heart that there was a reason they had not told him the truth about so many things. They'd only been doing what they thought best to protect him. For years, Luke Skywalker had come to terms with his father's dark past as the Sith Lord Darth Vader, choosing to forgive him for the atrocities he had committed. It was Luke's love for Anakin and his faith that there was still good within Darth Vader that had brought about his redemption and the destruction of the Sith. However, while Luke was aware that his father had helped the Emperor destroy the Jedi Knights, he didn't know the full story or specific details until decades later. During the events of the Legends Dark Nest trilogy, R2-D2 revealed footage of Operation Nightfall to Luke, showing Vader's attack on the Jedi Temple in its full brutality. R2 emitted a long, descending whistle, and the hologram of a large fountain-filled chamber appeared on the floor in front of Han. The viewing angle was from high in one corner, where a security cam might be mounted, and the only movement in the room was the water falling from the fountains. 3PO protested that R2 couldn't possibly have recorded this footage since it was obviously from a security feed, and R2 replied that he had stolen the file just before he and Anakin had left for Mustafar. The droid told 3PO and Luke that the recording was of a room in the old Jedi Temple, and Luke recognized it as the Room of 1,000 Fountains, which he had read about in old records. The hologram continued to show the empty room, and Han began to think that the little droid had found one more clever way to keep secrets. Given the effect that secret was likely to have on Luke, Han almost hoped that the droid had. But R2's acoustic signaler began to emit the tiny pew-pew of recorded blaster fire. Stray dashes of blue began to streak through the hologram, blowing fountains apart, burning holes in the walls, vanishing into the heights of the vaulted ceiling. Dozens of children, dressed in simple Jedi robes and wearing a single braid on the sides of their heads, began to retreat into the room. The youngest, those under 6 or 7, simply tried to run or find a place to hide. The older ones were attempting to fight, using the Force to hurl benches and pieces of broken fountain at their attackers. Some were firing captured blaster rifles, while a few were trying to use their newly constructed lightsabers to ricochet bolts at the unseen enemy. For the most part, they failed miserably but bravely, deflecting half a dozen or so attacks before one sneaked through and knocked them off their feet. The teenagers came next, backing into the room with their lightsabers whirling, weaving a wall of flashing energy before a column of advancing infantry. Dressed in what appeared to be early stormtrooper armor, the soldiers assaulted ruthlessly, cutting down fleeing 4-year-olds with the same brutal efficiency with which they slaughtered the Padawans. Han recognized the soldiers as clone troopers. A huge Jedi with stooped shoulders and a gnarled face backed into view, anchoring the line of teenage defenders, his lightsaber sending bolt after bolt back at the attackers, lashing out to cut down one trooper after another. A pair of Padawans stepped in to support his flanks, and the entire line stopped falling back, the lightsabers of the young Jedi weaving an impenetrable wall of energy that, for a few short moments, allowed nothing past. Not a blaster bolt, nor a clone trooper, nor even, it seemed to Han, a stray glance. A blue lightsaber appeared at the edge of the hollow, beating down the defense of the first Padawan and slashing through his torso, then slipping past the guard of the other one and cutting him down as well. A hooded figure appeared behind the blue blade and began to carry the attack to the stoop-shouldered Jedi. The two stood battling toe-to-toe for only an instant before the caped figure slipped a strike and brought his own blade down on the defender's stooped shoulder, cleaving him deep into the torso. The Jedi's gnarled face paled with shock, and he collapsed in too much pain to scream. The Padawans continued to battle on valiantly, but without the burly Jedi to anchor their line, they were no match for the sheer numbers assaulting them. Their defense collapsed, and the caped figure stepped aside, standing in seeming indifference as the clone troopers poured past to continue the slaughter of the children. Finally, the last of the children had fallen, and the clones stopped firing. The caped figure studied the room for a moment, then gave a barely perceptible nod and turned back toward the entrance. The face that stared into the cam was clouded with anger, the eyes sunken and dark, the mouth set in a grim slash, but there was no mistaking who it belonged to. Anakin Skywalker. Luke rose, telling R2 that was enough. Though his face maintained its composure, he proceeded to his personal quarters. Luke was incredibly disturbed by the footage, seeing his father so mercilessly kill children. Though he had long accepted that those events must have happened, to see them firsthand was something entirely different. But Luke was much older now, and had superior control over his emotions. He meditated alone, hovering in midair as he sought to center himself within the Force. Though his father's actions were indeed heinous, Luke still loved Anakin, and knew that his father had been corrupted and enslaved by the dark side of the Force. After losing his hand and lightsaber on Cloud City, Luke Skywalker returned to Tatooine, searching Obi-Wan Kenobi's hut for answers and Jedi knowledge. This story was first told in the Legends novel Shadows of the Empire, explaining how Luke built his green lightsaber. However, it was also expanded upon in The Life and Legend of Obi-Wan Kenobi, where Luke takes a closer look at Obi-Wan's journal and learns about the Clone Wars and, most importantly, the duel with Darth Vader on Mustafar. It's important to remember that this story takes place immediately after Episode 5, so Luke is still unsure if Vader really is his father, Anakin Skywalker, which is why he wants to learn the truth so badly. Of course, Obi-Wan is well known for bending the truth or wording things from a certain point of view, and his journal entries are no different. Still, Luke learning about the Mustafar duel is a truly monumental moment. As Luke drew closer to the entrance of Kenobi's hut, he sensed a strange tension in the air that reminded him of the disturbing sensation he felt in the cave on Dagobah. Stepping into the small living area, he found the chest that Obi-Wan had extracted his first lightsaber from, the saber that was once his father's. Luke opened the chest and was dismayed to find it completely empty. He hadn't expected to find a lightsaber, but he had hoped to find anything useful. If not a data tape or recording, at least some kind of clue. It didn't take long for Luke to find a trap door within the floor that led to the cellar. Down the bedrock steps, he found Obi-Wan's stores of food and water, a workbench surrounded by shelves of tools, and an intricately carved boa wood box. The keypad on the box opened at the touch of his thumbprint, and inside he found several books. The largest was a leather-bound volume that seemed ancient. On the first pages of that one was a note from Obi-Wan written for Luke, stating that the future of the Jedi Knights was in his hands. Luke blinked at the words as if to confirm they were real, that he wasn't just having a dream. The book felt suddenly very heavy in his hands. He set it down carefully on the workbench and began turning the pages. Every page was filled with handwritten text, and his heart began pounding harder as the various words and phrases caught his attention. Jedi Council, Old Republic, Battle of Naboo, Sith Lords, Jedi Temple, Separatist Movement, Battle of Geonosis, the Clone Wars. Luke stopped to catch his breath. He knew he should start at the beginning, but the book was so thick and he was impatient to find two names in particular. He began flipping through the pages even faster, scanning the text for the names, Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader, that he believed were the keys to the answers he sought. Ever since the duel on Cloud City, the two questions that dominated his mind were if Darth Vader was truly his father, and if he was, why Obi-Wan didn't tell him the truth. Kenobi had told him that he had served with his father, Anakin, during the Clone Wars, so when Luke finally found an entry about the Clone Wars in the journal, he became excited since his knowledge of the war was relatively limited. Most of the facts came from old data tapes, but only those that had been authorized by the Empire. Still, he knew that the Jedi Knights had led clone armies on behalf of the Galactic Republic against the Confederacy of Independent Systems. In the end, the Confederacy lost, the Jedi were accused of attempting to take over the Republic, and the Republic's leader, Palpatine, was proclaimed Emperor. According to Obi-Wan, it was Darth Vader who helped the Empire hunt down and destroy the Jedi. Luke turned his attention to the entry he had found and started reading it. Obi-Wan had made a notation that indicated the entry was almost 20 years old.
And then the purge began. I would soon learn that I was among the few Jedi to survive and that Palpatine had taken a new apprentice, my former student, Darth Vader. And because of Darth Vader, Anakin was gone as well. When I finally caught up with Vader, I sensed nothing but pure evil about him. For unlike Ventress, Vader was not a victim of unfortunate circumstances. Yes, he had his struggles and his shortcomings, but he was not a weak being who feared abandonment. He was a powerful man who had been given opportunities to better himself, yet he only craved more power, and chose his own path to betray the Jedi and become a Sith. He was my greatest failure. My duel with Vader was awful in its savagery. In the end, he was more determined to kill me than defend himself, and was blind with fury when I felled him. I left him maimed and burning on the shores of a lava river. To have dealt him a killing blow might have been the merciful thing to do, but I had no mercy for Vader. Because I am a Jedi, not a cold-blooded murderer, all I could do was leave Vader to his fate. Had I killed then and there, I believe I would have taken a step onto the same dark path that he had found so impossible to resist. But by leaving him for dead, I fear I failed yet again, for I soon learned that Vader had survived in a fashion. Like the late General Grievous, he is mostly machine now, a malevolent construct of pistons and gears, plastoid and wires. His mortal remains fueled by the dark side. The galaxy will never know peace until Darth Vader and the Emperor breathe their last. It is hard for me to see what the future holds. Fortunately, I have my mission and my ongoing studies of the Force to help me be mindful of the present, as well as the daily rigors of survival on Tatooine. Whatever tomorrow may bring, I must be ready for it.
By the time Luke reached the end of the entry, he realized he'd been holding his breath for over a minute. Exhaling slowly, he returned to the beginning, scanning the text to see if he had missed something. He had never heard of Asajj Ventress, Count Dooku, an Iridonian Zabrak, or any of the battles that Obi-Wan had mentioned, but these revelations barely even registered. Luke was frustrated that Kenobi hadn't written more about Anakin and Vader. He reread aloud the two lines that had especially commanded his attention. Palpatine had taken a new apprentice, my former student, Darth Vader. And because of Darth Vader, Anakin was gone as well. The words sounded hollow in his mouth. Although Obi-Wan had not written in so many words that Darth Vader had killed Anakin, That was what Obi-Wan had told him had happened. He wondered just how carefully Kenobi had chosen his words when he had written that Anakin was gone. And then he read again about how Obi-Wan had left Vader to die. Luke had no illusions that Darth Vader was a killer. Vader had also tortured both Princess Leia and Han Solo on different occasions. On Cloud City, Vader had maimed Luke before inviting him to join the dark side and help him overthrow the Emperor. But despite all the horrible things Vader had done, and despite the fact that Obi-Wan had had no mercy for Vader, Luke was surprised that he felt something other than horror or anger at the thought of the armored Lord of the Sith. He felt sorry for Vader. As a sting of phantom pain chewed at his right wrist where his prosthetic hand began, Luke wondered what exactly had happened all those years ago on an unidentified world along the shores of a lava river. The moment that Luke Skywalker refused to kill Darth Vader, choosing the light side of the Force and the way of the Jedi, is one of the most important moments in all of Star Wars. If you've watched my videos before, then you probably know that Luke is my favorite character, so I've made several different videos talking about this scene. And one comment that I see very consistently is people saying that Luke shouldn't have thrown away his lightsaber. He should have used it to fight Palpatine. Honestly, I think that everyone who says that simply doesn't understand the moment or what Luke is really doing. So I'd like to explain the actual reason in lore, meaning Luke's thoughts during that moment, and then give my own explanation of the events at the end. So, Luke's thoughts are described beautifully in the novelization of Return of the Jedi, and I just recently made a longer video detailing his thoughts throughout the entire confrontation with Palpatine, so check that out if you're interested. As Luke stared down at Vader's severed mechanical hand, and then at his own prosthetic hand, he realized just how much he had become like his father, like the man he hated. Standing over Vader, Luke wanted to destroy the Dark Lord, the being of darkness, the thing that was once his father and was once him. Suddenly, the Emperor was closer, encouraging Luke to kill Vader and fulfill his destiny by taking his father's place. Luke hesitated, and he knew that he was confronting true darkness. Then he realized that it was the darkness that he hated. Not Vader, not even the Emperor. He hated the darkness inside of them and in himself. And Luke decided that the only way to destroy darkness was to renounce it, for good and for all. He stood and made the decision for which he'd spent his life in preparation, and hurled his lightsaber away. So this is the moment that Luke Skywalker finally became a Jedi Knight. A Jedi's goal was to defend life, to keep peace, to stand against the corruption of the dark side, and that's exactly what Luke was doing. He stood in the face of darkness, the face of the Sith, and renounced their machinations. He decided that to destroy that darkness, he simply had to renounce it and proclaim himself a Jedi. He threw his lightsaber away because he refused to fight anymore. He refused violence. He refused the negative emotions of the dark side. Luke wouldn't play Palpatine's games anymore, and he used his compassion and love for his father to stand against his enemy. It truly is the moment he became a Jedi, and in my opinion, it's one of the most powerful and greatest moments in Luke Skywalker's journey. Desperate to save his friends from an uncertain doom that he had sensed in their future, Luke Skywalker abruptly abandoned his Jedi training against the wishes of his masters. Impulsively rushing into a confrontation that he was not ready for, Luke found himself facing the Dark Lord of the Sith, Darth Vader. Although he had learned much and felt the power of the Force flowing through him, Luke was still not strong enough mentally to conquer the obstacle that Vader represented. Their duel on Cloud City was not only a clash of light and dark, a struggle of the rebellion against the Empire, it was also a conflict between father and son. In the novelization of The Empire Strikes Back, Luke's thoughts and emotions while fighting Vader are explained, providing some shocking insight and context. Keeping his blaster clutched in his hand, Luke rose into the carbon freezing chamber. The room was deathly quiet, except for the hissing of steam escaping from some of the pipes. It appeared to Luke that he was the only living creature in this chamber of strange machinery and chemical containers, but he sensed that he was not alone. He could feel that Vader was here somewhere. Suddenly, Vader spoke from nearby, admitting that the Force was with Luke, but he was not a Jedi yet. Luke took cautious steps toward the dark figure and holstered his blaster. He felt a wave of confidence surge through him, and he felt completely ready to face the Dark Lord, one warrior against another. He sensed that the Force was with him and that he was finally ready for this inevitable battle. He slowly mounted the stairs toward Vader, drawing his lightsaber, yet he suddenly hesitated as he remembered the words of his masters when he had left Dagobah. Obi-Wan and Yoda had told him to use the Force only for knowledge and defense, not as a weapon. As the Dark Lord waited for him to attack, Luke felt his hatred for Vader surge inside of him, and he lunged, bringing his blade down upon Vader's red one. Effortlessly, Vader deflected the blow, and then another, and the two of them stood staring at one another for an endless moment. Luke was undaunted, slowly driving Vader backwards on the platform. The Sith Lord spoke calmly, complimenting that Luke had control of his fear, to which the young Jedi student replied that he was full of surprises. Suddenly, Vader swiftly hooked Luke's saber out of his hands and sent it flying away, as he slashed at Luke and sent him tumbling down the stairs to avoid the blow. Sprawled on the lower platform, Luke looked up to see the dark figure flying towards him. Quickly, he rolled to one side as Vader landed near him and taunted him, encouraging him to embrace the dark side. Vader's words had a strong influence on Luke, as though they were alive. He told himself not to listen, and that Vader was trying to lead him astray, to trick him into falling to the dark side. Luke began to back away, and Vader lunged towards him, so forcefully that he fell backwards into the gaping chamber. Vader turned away from the carbon freezing pit and activated it, yet while his back was turned, a blur suddenly rushed upwards. The Dark Lord turned around, seeing Luke hanging from the hoses draped across the ceiling. Vader admitted that he was impressed, and Luke dropped back to the platform, summoning his fallen lightsaber back into his hand with the Force. Luke felt more controlled, and he eyed Vader with more caution than before, resolving not to be swayed by his enemy's words. He remembered Yoda's training to cast out all hatred and anger and receive the Force. Gaining more control over his negative emotions, Luke began to advance, ignoring Vader's goading. As their blades clashed again, he began to realize just how powerful the Sith Lord was. Luke defiantly stated that he would not become a slave to the dark side, and lunged at Vader with a powerful swing, sending him backwards and falling onto the lower level of the chamber. Luke's knees nearly buckled with the exhaustion of battling Vader, but he gathered his remaining strength and cautiously looked down. He saw no sign of his enemy, so he dropped himself down to the lower level and began to search. He found himself proceeding through a large tunnel that let him out into a control and maintenance room. Vader's breathing echoed around him, and Luke turned, igniting his saber, but Vader did not move to engage him this time. Instead, he taunted Luke once more, inviting him to destroy him. Vader's words confused Luke, causing him to hesitate, and he contemplated what he should do. Should he act on Vader's words and thus use the Force as a tool of revenge? Or should he step away from this battle and hope for another chance to fight Vader when he gained better control? How could he delay the opportunity to destroy this evil being? He decided that his chance was there and now, and he must not waste it. Before he could attack, A large piece of machinery detached itself from the wall behind him and came hurtling towards his back. Turning quickly, Luke was able to slice the object in half, before turning back again and engaging Vader in a brief clash of blades. A second object sped toward him now, and then another. Luke fought to repel the onslaught of machinery, tools, and objects flying at him from all directions. Bombarded on all sides, Luke did what he could to deflect the assault, but he was beginning to get bloodied and bruised in the attempt. Another large piece flew by and crashed through the large window, letting in the screaming wind. Suddenly, everything in the room was blown about, and the wind lashed Luke's body and filled the room with a banshee-like howl. Vader braced himself and remained in place, as Luke was pulled through the window by the strong wind. Everything became a great blur as the wind carried him down, until he managed to grab hold of a beam. With the wind subsided slightly and his vision cleared, Luke realized that he was hanging from the gantry of the reactor shaft just outside of the control room. Glancing down, he saw an endless abyss of lights and metal. A wave of dizziness swept over him and he attempted to calm himself with the Force to avoid panicking. He managed to pull himself up and slowly made his way back to the nearest entrance tunnel. He proceeded inside, wary of his surroundings, when suddenly the towering form of Vader sprang out of the darkness, driving him back from where he had just came. The Sith Lord's unwavering onslaught pushed them both out onto a narrow walkway. Vader insisted that Luke was beaten and demanded that he not resist defeat. Luke defiantly unleashed his own series of attacks, fighting with renewed vigor, and managed to wound Vader's shoulder. It seemed to Luke that the Dark Lord was in pain, but only for a moment, and then Vader advanced on him again. Luke was breathing hard, yet Vader had mentioned Obi-Wan's name, which instilled a sudden sense of calm within him. As he watched Vader approach, it seemed that the Sith Lord wanted to take his life, or worse, his soul. As their blades engaged again, with Vader slashing away, he was suddenly able to sear through Luke's wrist, sending his hand and lightsaber falling into the abyss. The pain was excruciating, and Luke smelled the terrible odor of his own burnt flesh as he squeezed his forearm beneath his armpit to stop the agony. He moved backward, away from Vader and out onto the narrow beam. Vader loomed over him, insisting that he needed to learn the ways of the dark side in order to destroy the Emperor. Luke refused, insisting that he would never join him. Then, Vader questioned whether Obi-Wan had told him what happened to his father, and Luke replied that he knew Vader had killed him. The Dark Lord then provided the shocking revelation that he was Luke's father, Anakin Skywalker. Luke stared with disbelief, pulling away, refusing to believe what he had just heard, insisting that it wasn't true. Vader told him to search his feelings, and Luke was horror-stricken by the words. His mind whirled. Everything was finally beginning to coalesce in his brain. Or was it? He wondered if Vader were telling him the truth. If the training of Yoda, the teachings of Obi-Wan, his own striving for good and his abhorrence of evil, if everything he had fought for were no more than a lie. He didn't want to believe Vader. He tried convincing himself that it was Vader who lied to him, but somehow he could feel the truth in the Dark Lord's words. But if Vader did speak the truth, then he wondered why Obi-Wan would lie to him. His mind screamed louder than the wind around them. The answers no longer seemed to matter as he looked at his father. With the calmness that Obi-Wan and Yoda had taught him, Luke Skywalker made what might have been his final decision. He stepped out into the empty abyss beneath him and felt as though he were falling into another galaxy entirely. His body quickly plunged downward until it was sucked into an exhaust pipe in the side of the reactor shaft. Luke tumbled down, trying to grab anything to slow his fall through the tube. At last, he came to a stop, and he felt desperation wash over him as he called out to Obi-Wan for help in his mind. After losing his lightsaber on Cloud City, Luke Skywalker was in desperate need of a new weapon to continue his Jedi training. Having no knowledge of where to find or build a new one, Luke returned to Tatooine, searching for knowledge in the old hut of Obi-Wan Kenobi. How Luke came to construct his legendary green lightsaber is explained in the Legends novel Shadows of the Empire. The hut was a small structure on the edge of the Dune Sea, and he discovered that Obi-Wan had not left much behind. The most valuable thing that remained was an old boa wood trunk, the contents of which included an ancient leather-bound book. The thumbprint clasp attached to the book had accepted Luke's right thumb to unlock it, and he discovered a small explosive rigged inside. If anyone else had attempted to open the book, it would have burst into flames. Somehow, Obi-Wan had known that Luke would find the book, and prepared it so that only he could open it. Luke found that amazing. The pages of the book contained all kinds of knowledge that a Jedi student would need, such as plans for building a lightsaber. According to the book, the best lightsabers used natural crystals. However, it was impossible for Luke to find one on Tatooine. During the reign of the Empire, the Imperials made great efforts to destroy the last remaining resources of the Jedi Order, banning all crystals capable of being used in lightsabers. The Empire overtook, destroyed, and shut down the sites that possessed crystals naturally, so Luke was forced to fabricate a synthetic crystal. He had managed to collect most of the electronic and mechanical parts he needed in Mos Eisley, such as power cells, controls, and a high-energy reflector cup. Ideally, the best lightsabers contained 3 crystals, consisting of different densities and facets, in order to produce a fully adjustable blade. However, since it was his first attempt at building a lightsaber, Luke decided to simplify the weapon as much as possible, opting to use only 1 crystal. Using a small furnace, Luke fabricated the crystal, cooking it at incredible heat and pressure. He had no idea how long the entire process took, but it had taken him a month to get to the point of creating the crystal itself. Once it was finished, he would be able to cut and mold it, and tune it to the conditions of the hilt. Luke was very nervous about constructing the saber, as he worried that he might misread the instructions and cause the weapon to explode when he tried to ignite it. He wondered if he might accidentally disintegrate himself and become known as the Jedi Knight that had been vaporized by a faulty lightsaber. He worried that he would fail in building it, since he had worked for a month on only the crystal, while the book said that a Jedi Master could construct a saber within a few days. Luke anticipated that he may need to build several sabers before he got one that worked correctly. When the crystal was finally done, Luke set to work meticulously chiseling and hammering away, cracking off slivers to achieve the perfect size and shape. The cuts became trickier as he progressed, and if he hit the crystal too hard, he would shatter it and have to start over. Finally, after the crystal was inserted into the completed hilt, Luke went outside to test the saber. That way, if it blew up, it would at least not destroy Obi-Wan's hut. He instructed R2 to wait inside, so that if he was disintegrated, someone could tell Leia what happened. When he was alone, he pushed the ignition switch, and the glowing green blade extruded to full length, humming with power. Relieved, he studied the saber, noticing that it felt perfectly balanced, even more than his father's. The blade gave off no heat, indicating that the superconductors worked properly. As R2 approached, Luke deactivated the saber, feeling relief that he had successfully built the elegant weapon and it worked. That meant something. As he looked up at the sky, he thought to himself that maybe he would learn to become a Jedi Master after all. In the aftermath of his duel with Darth Vader on Cloud City, Luke Skywalker was left physically and emotionally scarred. The shocking revelation that Vader was his father, Anakin Skywalker, shook Luke to his core, filling his mind with uncertainty and disrupting his connection to the Force. Plagued by feelings of doubt in regards to his destiny and resentment for his Jedi Masters who had lied to him about his parentage, Luke questioned what his next steps would be. The canon book Skywalker: A Family at War explains Luke's traumatic reaction and thoughts immediately after the duel. While Bacta soothed Luke's cauterized wound, no remedy could ease his mind, which lingered on the emotional torment occasioned by Darth Vader's confession. In those moments, Luke felt even more lost and confused than he had in the cave on Dagobah. Aboard the Falcon, he could feel Vader encroaching upon his mind. For a time, Luke suffered through the tangled mess of his own noble instincts, Vader's insidious proposal of shared power, and Kenobi's evasive story of Anakin's demise. Luke knew that he couldn't trust anything Vader said, and yet, searching his feelings, he was hard-pressed to reject the idea. Mentally exhausted, he searched for answers in the Force. He called out again to Obi-Wan, wondering over and over, if Vader spoke the truth, why Obi-Wan hadn't revealed the dark secret of his parentage. When Luke tired of calling for Obi-Wan, he reached out to Master Yoda. He felt certain that the Jedi could hear him, sense his pain, maybe even see what had become of him. However, Yoda too remained silent. It was enough to make Luke want to quit his Jedi path altogether. At around the same age Anakin had been when he became Darth Vader, Luke felt abandoned by the Jedi he had trusted. He was also prey to a nagging fear that, if what Vader had told him was true, then all hope might be lost. If Vader was right, first Obi-Wan and then Yoda had lied. And Luke couldn't puzzle out why they would withhold such a momentous truth from him, except to manipulate him into doing their bidding. Which brought Luke to a startling conclusion. The Jedi were no better than the Sith. Their intentions may have been noble, but their execution was seriously flawed. The light was no stronger than the darkness, and both could bring a man to ruin. If he couldn't be a Jedi, as Obi-Wan had promised, Luke wondered what he would become, with his singular combination of Force abilities and unchecked emotions. For a time, Luke retreated into himself, cutting himself off from the Force altogether. Eventually, after returning to Cloud City to search for his lightsaber, yet choosing not to recover the weapon, Luke found himself drawn to an alternate path, one that diverged from the challenges immediately facing the rebel cause. He was more determined than ever to discover the mysteries of the Force and become a Jedi, but with an important caveat. He no longer wished to follow in his father's footsteps. He no longer even wished to hold Obi-Wan in the same esteem. He sensed that a different road, all his own, lay before him, leading him to do better than those who had come before. Through the Force, he felt the first glimmer of knowledge, something beckoning him toward a destiny that was neither tied to the Jedi of the Republic, nor bound to his father's wickedness. In canon, after losing his father's lightsaber on Cloud City, Luke Skywalker briefly took up a yellow lightsaber as he continued to operate as a Jedi Knight. He had found the saber in an abandoned Jedi temple from the High Republic era, and continued to wield it until it was destroyed while Luke and his friends were trapped in a realm called No Space. In a battle with ancient droids that once belonged to the Nile, Luke suffered through both his mechanical hand and his lightsaber being crushed. After his confrontation with his father on Cloud City, Luke's ability to use the Force became strained, and he described it as sometimes feeling like a whisper, and other times feeling stronger than ever before. After the destruction of his yellow saber, Luke was immediately aware that he needed a new weapon, but also that he needed to understand his connection with the Force through training. After he and his friends had escaped from no space, Luke examined the yellow Kyber crystal of the saber, admitting to R2 that he didn't know much about them at all. At this point, Luke had recovered one of the sacred Jedi texts, but he was disappointed to see that the information it held about Kyber crystals was all philosophy, describing how Jedi would go to Ilum to find crystals. Luke and R2 had traveled to Ilum once, shortly after his duel with Vader, only to find the planet completely under Imperial control. Luke realized that choosing a crystal and building a saber had been a rite of passage for the Jedi of the past. He thought that perhaps Yoda and Obi-Wan had never taught him any of this because he already had his father's lightsaber, but he realized that both that saber and his yellow one weren't really his, since he did not bond with the crystal or build the sabers himself. Igniting the yellow saber, he told R2 that he never felt a connection with the yellow crystal, and that the saber itself had been merely a good tool until now, nothing more. Now that the crystal was cracked, the saber barely worked and was highly unstable. Studying the Jedi text, Luke was frustrated to see that it had no instructions on how to actually build a saber. He realized that the first step was obtaining a new crystal before he could even consider building a new hilt, and the text mentioned other worlds where Kyber could be found. Aside from needing a new saber, Luke also felt like he needed to take control of his own destiny, since his connection to the Force was disrupted and he found it difficult to continue his training. Setting out to find a new crystal, Luke and R2 traveled to Christophsis, which was under Imperial rule but without much of a physical presence. Landing outside a small mining town, Luke hoped to find crystal prospectors eager to sell their inventory. According to the Book of Jedi texts, Christophsis was one of the few places that Kyber crystals could be found. However, they were still incredibly rare and the planet didn't have as much as Ilum. Luke told R2 that trading Kyber was illegal in the Empire, but Lando had told him that there was still an active black market operating on Christophsis. Since the Empire didn't bother mining the Kyber themselves on Christophsis, the local prospectors would sell whatever they found, and Luke hoped to obtain one by posing as a buyer. Handing his broken lightsaber to R2, Luke admitted that his plan wasn't very good, which is why R2 would be his backup if things went south. Entering a cantina, Luke ordered a drink and casually mentioned to the bartender that he was hoping to conduct business. He said that since Christophsis had a reputation for having some of the best gems available, he was hoping to source some rare pieces from the local prospectors. The bartender, very interested, leaned in and asked Luke what he was specifically looking for, and that he could point him in the right direction for a small fee. Luke repeated that he was looking for the rarest crystals, and the bartender quietly confirmed that he must want Kyber. Suddenly, a blaster bolt flew through the bartender's chest as Luke looked around in shock. He watched as every patron in the bar was gunned down by a woman holding two blasters. She quickly dropped them, putting her hands up and asking him what he was going to do about it, and she knew his name. R2 rolled in behind her, and Luke quickly summoned his broken saber, ordering the woman to explain herself. She said that she had just saved his life and introduced herself as Greta. Luke noticed a blaster behind the bar, but was not yet convinced. Greta explained that the rumor that one could simply buy Kyber on Christophsis was a lie. The town really survived because the locals would simply capture anyone who came looking for Kyber and sell them to the Empire. When Luke asked why she saved him, she said that he was a Jedi, maybe the only Jedi. She explained that her and a few others still believed in the Jedi, and she suspected that Luke or another Jedi might come searching for crystals since Ilum was completely occupied. Luke was disappointed with her for killing the people in the bar, even if it was to save him, and he left to go find Kyber on his own. Greta quickly yelled that he was going the wrong way, and insisted that he let her help him. Luke replied that he didn't want her help, since the only thing he knew about her was that she was a killer. Greta explained that she was born on Jedha, and her family were all Falanasi, an order of Force users. When the Empire destroyed Jeddah City 4 years earlier, they killed her entire family. She told Luke that when he destroyed the Death Star, he avenged her family's deaths and closed a hole in her heart. She asked him to let her repay the favor. Luke told R2 to go back to the ship and wait for him, and to tell the others where he was if he didn't return. As they sped away, Luke asked Greta about the Falanasi and if they used Kyber crystals themselves. She replied that they didn't, and the Falanasi hadn't been Force sensitive for many generations, but they considered the Force to be a great mystery and wanted to understand it. She told Luke that they were looking for a man named Kawada. She explained that when the Empire built the Death Star, they brought together the best minds who knew about Kyber to design it, and Kawada was an academic researcher that specialized in Kyber. Kawada had fled the Empire when his colleagues began disappearing, and came to Christophsis to hide and study Kyber. They soon found Kawada, who politely asked Luke for his broken saber. When Luke asked why, Kawada began speaking to the numerous Kyber crystals that hung around his neck, explaining that the crystals thought that Luke needed his help. Luke admitted that he did need help, and handed over the saber, which Kawada quickly proceeded to dismantle so he could inspect the yellow crystal. He noted that the crystal was almost broken in half, and he assured Luke that he could somewhat repair it, but he would want something in return. Inside Kawada's laboratory, he noted that Luke's saber seemed to be weirdly built, and Luke explained that both he and R2 had tinkered with it. Kawada chastised him, explaining that fiddling with a lightsaber could cause it to explode. Luke explained that lightsaber maintenance wasn't part of his training, since he had to learn a lot in a little amount of time. Kawada showed him the 5 main parts of the lightsaber: the power cell, the casing, the focusing lens, the emitter, and the crystal itself. He explained that the crystal was the key, and it focused not only the energy from the power cell but from the Force, and that a good connection to the user could allow the saber to feel like it was moving by itself. Greta asked Luke if he had ever felt anything like that, and he replied that he hadn't, with both of the sabers he had owned. Kawada said that was because Luke had found the sabers, he had not chosen the crystals, and they had not chosen him. Luke explained that his first saber had belonged to his father, a great Jedi, which Kawada admitted was better, but still not the same. Examining the cracked yellow crystal, he told Luke that he could somewhat fix it by diverting energy around the cracked part to make it more stable. He then pulled out a red crystal, which was what he wanted Luke for. Kawada said that he had heard there was a way to pull the dark side out of red crystals through the Force, and he wanted Luke to do it for observation purposes. Luke was quick to point out that he had never even heard of anything like that, but Greta interjected that she had. She explained that the Falanasi had their own ritual for cleansing Kyber, which they had offered as a service after the fall of the Sith, and the Jedi Order had asked them to heal as many red crystals as possible. She told Luke that in order for a crystal to be made red, it had to be bled by a dark side user, who would pour their rage, pain, and fear into the crystal, leaving it in scarlet agony. To heal it, Luke would have to do the opposite, by using the light side and his own joy and hope to offset the pain that the bleeding caused. She warned that the process would be difficult, but Luke said that he would give it a try. Sitting down, he began to meditate on the red crystal. He suddenly found himself transported into some terrifying dimension, seemingly a world within the dark side itself. In the distance, he saw his father, Darth Vader, and then the vision flashed out and sent him back into the real world. Kawada eagerly asked Luke what he had seen, with a clipboard in hand. Luke shakily replied that he had seen his father, which caused Kawada to wonder why a great Jedi would be inside a red crystal. Greta insisted that he leave Luke alone, and that he needed to fulfill his end of the bargain. Kawada agreed, but he gave Luke another crystal, one that was clear and raw, and asked Luke to try to connect with it. He assured Luke that the process should be much easier than with the red crystal, and Luke reluctantly sat down again, focusing on the clear crystal. He found himself face to face with Master Yoda. Luke said that he knew this vision wasn't real, but he asked Yoda why he had never answered when he would call out to him through the Force. He said that he had been trying to learn everything on his own and had been hurt, and asked why Yoda didn't help him. Yoda replied that all Jedi must walk their own path, and that Luke must know this or else he would have returned to Dagobah already for more training. He said that Luke must not have truly wanted to speak with him, or he would have. He told Luke that a great decision lay before him that had nothing to do with the Force or the Jedi. It was a decision that Luke needed to make about himself, and until he did, he could not be a Jedi. Luke grew agitated, telling Yoda that he always said so much without actually saying anything. Luke said that he would be fine without Yoda's help, and he said goodbye to his master. After Luke vanished, Obi-Wan's Force Spirit appeared, and Yoda asked for his thoughts. Obi-Wan said that after all Luke had learned, he was still not ready. Yoda replied that he was right, yet Luke had learned much and had still appeared to them, even if he didn't understand what he was doing. He said that when the time came, Luke would be ready. Emerging from the vision, Luke found the crystal in his palm, only now it was green. Kawada handed him the broken saber, saying that while it wasn't perfect, it should work until Luke decided to replace the crystal. Luke thanked him for fixing it, but said that he was leaving and taking the green crystal with him, since he would need to build his own lightsaber one day. Luke also took the red crystal, hopeful that he could learn more and one day heal it. Back at his X-Wing, Luke thanked Greta for her help, saying that he had learned things he never dreamed of. Greta told him that since she had helped him, she felt as though she had fulfilled the debt she owed her family, and would be leaving Christophsis. She asked Luke if he would be returning to the Alliance, and he replied that he would eventually, but holding the green crystal in one hand and the red in the other, he told her that he had some thinking to do. When Luke Skywalker faced his greatest test and confronted not only the darkness within himself, but the Sith, he declared himself a Jedi Knight and renounced the Lord of the Dark Side. Yet the conflict was not over. Luke's refusal placed him at the mercy of the Emperor, and he was struck by deadly Force lightning. As we've seen before in the case of Grandmaster Yoda in the prequel trilogy, it was possible for a Jedi to catch or deflect Force lightning. This raises several questions about why Luke didn't defend himself when the Emperor used lightning against him. Did Luke know about Force lightning at all? Was he aware that he could deflect it? Or did Yoda ever teach him how or warn him about Force lightning? There actually is some very interesting information given about this in the novelization of Return of the Jedi. First, let's look at what we know from the lore about deflecting Force lightning. It was possible, as Yoda could do it, however it isn't fully explained how he did or how he learned how to do it. In the novelization of Attack of the Clones, it's stated that it required great effort from Yoda to accomplish, and Dooku was shocked when Yoda did so. Afterwards, as explained in the Legends novel Labyrinth of Evil, Dooku believed that the only way Yoda could have known how to deflect Force lightning was by using the dark side himself. But the reason that it may seem odd that Luke didn't deflect the lightning is because Yoda was his master, so it stands to reason that Yoda should have taught him about that aspect of the Force, since he was training Luke to one day confront the Sith. But perhaps Yoda decided not to. After all, Luke's training on Dagobah was more of a crash course on learning how to control his emotions and access the powers of the Force. Maybe it isn't so unreasonable to think that Yoda didn't teach him about Force lightning because he didn't think Luke was going to leave Dagobah so abruptly. However, in the novelization of Return of the Jedi, Luke's thoughts are explained just as Palpatine attacks him with lightning, which finally gives us the full answer to our question. Palpatine raised his spidery arms toward Luke, and blinding white bolts of energy burst from his fingers, shot across the room like sorcerous lightning, and tore through Luke's insides. The young Jedi was at once confounded and in agony. He'd never heard of such a power, such a corruption of the Force, let alone experienced it. But if it was a power through the Force, Luke thought that perhaps it could be repelled by the Force. He raised his arms to deflect the bolts of lightning. Initially, he was successful. The lightning rebounded from his touch, harmlessly hitting the walls. Soon, though, the shocks came with such speed and power, they coursed over and into him, and he could only shrink before them, convulsing with pain. His powers diminished. So, the novelization confirms that Luke didn't know what Force lightning was, yet, shockingly enough, he was able to deflect it with his bare hands for a brief moment. It's honestly just a great moment that shows how much raw power Luke had in the Force, even if he was only able to deflect Palpatine's lightning for a moment. The confrontation between Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader, and Emperor Palpatine was not only the climax of the original Star Wars trilogy, but in-universe, it was one of the most important events in galactic history. It led to the redemption of Anakin Skywalker, the collapse of most of the Galactic Empire, and Luke Skywalker finally becoming a Jedi Knight. One of the most interesting moments in the clash of the three figures came when, out of desperation, Luke actually gave into the dark side and attempted to kill the Emperor, but Vader blocked the blow. I honestly didn't realize that Luke did try to kill Palpatine until I was an adult and I had seen the movie 1,000 times. I always just thought that he started dueling Vader. I've seen discussions about why Vader blocked Luke's blow. Some people say he was protecting Luke from making the same mistakes he did in the past. Others say he was simply protecting the Emperor because he was still a slave to the dark side at that time. The novelization of Return of the Jedi actually explains the very specific reasoning that Vader had for blocking that blow and stopping Luke from killing Palpatine in that moment, and it's probably not what you would expect. The book fleshes out Vader's plan to turn Luke to the dark side so they can overthrow Palpatine and rule the galaxy together, and that's something that Vader thinks about over the course of the entire book. When the Emperor arrived on the Death Star, Vader pondered the feeling of power that his master gave him, and how soon that power would be passed to him and Luke. Vader felt complete at Palpatine's side. Though the emptiness at his core never left him, it became a glorious emptiness in the glare of the Emperor's power, an exalted void that could encompass the universe. Vader knew it someday would encompass the universe when Palpatine was dead, for that was his final dream. When he'd learned all he could of the dark side, he would take that power from his master and kill him, keeping that darkness at his own core. He would then rule the universe with his son at his side. His other dream was to reclaim his son and show Luke the majesty of the dark side. He knew that Luke would come with him. He could sense in the Force that the completion of his dream was near. Much later, as Vader waited for Luke to surrender on Endor as the Emperor had predicted, he again sensed the future through the Force, yet it was clouded and he could not feel the specifics. He could feel that his destiny would be fulfilled soon, but he couldn't fully comprehend what that meant. That sense through the Force felt like a drum getting louder inside his mind. He could feel dread all around, and fear that excited him. He knew that those negative emotions would heighten his senses and hone his passion within the dark side. He also sensed victory and mastery, but they were laced with something else that he could not discern. The future was still in motion even as he sensed it, and it was difficult for him to see. Its apparitions tantalized him. His future was clouded, thunderous with conquest and destruction, but still he could feel that his destiny was so near. Afterwards, as the Emperor forced Luke to watch the battle outside the Death Star, Vader sensed his son's power, and again thought of how soon they would destroy Palpatine and rule the galaxy. Luke was stronger than he had ever imagined, and Vader perceived that he was not yet lost to either side of the Force or the Emperor's will. There was still time for him to take Luke for his own, to join with him in the dark side and rule together. It would only take patience and power to show Luke the satisfactions of the darkness. The book describes how, as Luke watched the rebel fleet being massacred, the dark side was with him, and Vader sensed it. Finally, Luke could no longer resist his anger, and he ignited his lightsaber, swinging it with his full weight down at the Emperor's skull. In the same instant, Vader's blade ignited as well, blocking Luke's attack a mere inch away from Palpatine's head. Vader and Luke then engaged in battle as the Emperor watched with pleasure. In the moment that their duel began, Vader contemplated the exact reason why he couldn't let Luke kill the Emperor. He was impressed with his son's speed, and he regretted that he had needed to stop his strike. He knew that Luke was not emotionally ready to kill the Emperor yet. Vader thought that there was still a chance that Luke might return to his friends if he killed the Emperor in that moment, and decided that his son still needed more training before he would be ready to assume his place as Vader's right hand. So Vader decided that he needed to guide Luke further, to stop him from doing damage in the wrong places or in the right places prematurely. So, the confirmed reason that Vader stopped Luke from killing the Emperor wasn't necessarily to protect him from falling to the dark side. It was simply because Vader wanted to guide his fall into darkness and make sure that he was trained and ready. It's pretty dark, and it's not as nice as it would be if he was just protecting his son, but it's the confirmed reason in lore. Luke Skywalker's harrowing experience inside the Cave of Evil on Dagobah was not only a dark vision of a possible future inflicted by the dark side, but was one of the most important lessons on his journey to become a Jedi Knight. The specter of Vader and Luke's face appearing inside its shattered helmet symbolized Luke's own darkness, but also the dark path that lay before him if he chose to follow in his father's footsteps. While his trek into the cave served as one of his Jedi trials, Luke ultimately failed the test. In the novelization of The Empire Strikes Back, Luke's thoughts and emotions as he explored the cave and battled the vision inside are explained, giving additional depth to this powerful moment in the saga. As Luke continued his training with Yoda, he finally felt as though he was progressing. He had at last begun to detach himself from the emotion of pride, and he felt unburdened, finally open to experience the flow of the Force fully. As they finished a lesson, Yoda was pleased with Luke's improvement, but the young Jedi student found himself distracted by a sudden feeling of danger, an echo of evil on the edge of his mind. He told his master that something wasn't right, and he could feel danger and death nearby. Luke observed his surroundings, trying to discern what was emitting such a powerful dark aura. As he gazed around, he spotted a huge, tangled tree, its gigantic roots having grown to form the opening of a sinister cave. Transfixed by the unsettling appearance of the cave, he breathed hard and found himself unable to speak, until he finally realized that Yoda had led him to this spot purposefully. Sensing his understanding, the old Jedi Master informed him that the tree was strong with the dark side, and that Luke needed to go inside. He warily asked Yoda what waited in the cave, and Yoda cryptically replied only what he took with him. Luke looked at his master, and then back at the tree, silently deciding to take his courage and his willingness to learn inside with him. He found the determination to step into the darkness and face whatever was waiting for him, but suddenly decided that he would also bring his lightsaber. He stepped toward the dark opening in the roots when Yoda's voice stopped him, insisting that he would not need his weapons. Luke paused, considering Yoda's shocking instruction. How could he go into an evil cave completely unarmed? As skilled as he had become, he did not feel quite equal to that test yet. He continued forward as Yoda said nothing more. It was dark enough inside the cave that Luke could practically feel it against his skin. It was so dark that any light was quickly absorbed and he could barely see in front of him. As he slowly moved forward, slimy, drippy things brushed against his face, and the moisture from the soggy ground began to seep into his boots. He pushed through the unsettling blackness, his eyes slowly growing accustomed to the dark. He saw a corridor before him and proceeded forward, his anxiety and fear slowly building. He considered then turning back and searching for the exit, but he braced himself and ventured deeper into the dark chamber. He felt the space around him widen as he moved forward, straining his eyes and trying his best to hear what lay ahead. Then, Luke heard a very loud noise, a sound that he had heard in his nightmares. The labored breathing of a being that had once been a man. Out of the darkness, the towering figure of Darth Vader emerged, lumbering toward him. Prepared by his disciplined Jedi training, Luke was ready. He raised his lightsaber and perfectly sidestepped Vader's attack. In the same moment, Luke felt his mind and body completely focused, and he summoned the Force. Feeling its power coursing within him, he raised his saber and brought it crashing down on Vader's head. With that one powerful stroke, the Dark Lord's helmet was severed from his body, crashing to the ground and rolling along the cave floor. As Luke watched in astonishment, the helmet came to rest directly in front of him and cracked in half with a small explosion. He was shocked to see the broken helmet reveal not the imagined face of Vader, but Luke's own face looking up at him. He gasped, horrified at the sight, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the decapitated head faded away into the darkness like a ghostly vision. Luke stared at the space where the head had been, his mind reeling, the emotions raging inside him almost too much to bear. He told himself that it must have been the tree. It was all some trick of the horrible cave, some cruel ploy of Yoda's brought about because he had brought his weapons with him. He wondered if he were really fighting himself, or if he had fallen prey to the temptations of the dark side. Perhaps he might become a figure as evil as Darth Vader. Luke wondered if there might be some even darker meaning behind the unsettling vision that he could not comprehend yet. It was a long while before he was able to emerge from the darkness of the cave, and when he did, he found Master Yoda still sitting on a nearby root in quiet observation. When Luke Skywalker entered Jabba's palace, returning to his homeworld of Tatooine as a changed man, he was at an important and conflicted stage in his journey to become a Jedi Knight. I've explained this in a recent video essay about Luke's journey, but just for some brief context, one of the main points of Return of the Jedi is Luke standing between the light and dark sides of the Force. That is why George Lucas decided to dress Luke in black for the movie, not only to symbolize the dark side, but so that he would look like Darth Vader. When we see Luke enter Jabba's palace in the movie, he not only looks like Vader, but he acts like him too, choking the guards and delivering some threatening lines to Jabba. That's a detail that always stood out to me, because Luke acts pretty un-Jedi-like during those scenes, boasting about his power and just threatening to blatantly destroy Jabba. Now, the novelization of Return of the Jedi actually provides some very dark details about Luke's mental state and his thoughts during those moments in Jabba's palace, revealing that he was even closer to the dark side than originally thought. I was honestly shocked when I read these details in the book because it seems so far from Luke's character, But the book confirms that he was feeling the corruption of the dark side while inside the palace. As Luke entered the main gate, he was no longer the young farm boy that had fled Tatooine 4 years earlier. He was a man, wiser and aged by the losses he had endured. The loss of illusions, dependency, friends, sleep, laughter, and even his hand. Of all his losses, the greatest was that which came from knowledge and from the deep recognition that he could never unlearn what he had learned. There were so many things that he wished he never knew, and he had aged with the weight of this knowledge. Knowledge brought benefits to him, of course. He was less impulsive than he had been in his youth. Manhood had granted him perspective, a framework in which to fit the events of his life. That is, a lattice of space and time coordinates spanning his existence, back to his earliest memories, ahead to 100 alternative futures. A lattice of depths and conundrums through which Luke could peer at any new event in his life with perspective. A lattice of shadows and corners, rolling back to the vanishing point on the horizon of Luke's mind. All the shadow boxes that lent him perspective also cast a certain darkness upon him. Though he may not have fully understood it, he could feel the dark side. The darkness may have given an edge to his personality, adding an odd dimension to him, but it was still darkness. There were other advantages to knowledge, and he had become skilled in the ways of the Jedi. He knew that he must continue to grow, but the sum of all his knowledge brought a certain sadness to him, even a slight hint of regret. Yet he knew that he could no longer afford to be a boy during the time of great war. Luke did not hesitate or pay any mind to choking the guards that confronted him in the main hallway of the palace. That act was not the way of the Jedi, yet Luke did not seem to notice anything wrong with his actions. That may have been an example of the darkness clouding his mind. Luke was incredibly focused when he came before Jabba, even ignoring Leia's pain and anguish, blocking it completely from his mind. He could not afford to be distracted at all. As Jabba showed no signs of cooperating, Luke changed his stance, internally and externally, informing Jabba that he could either work with them or be destroyed, and he advised the Hutt not to underestimate his powers. That last arrogant remark, so far from the behavior of a Jedi Knight, echoed the dark words of his father on Mustafar years before. Much later, after Luke had been captured and he, Han, Leia, and Chewie had been sentenced to death, Luke was unable to suppress his satisfaction. He found Jabba despicable and thought of him as a leech of the galaxy that sucked the life from whatever he touched. Luke wanted to burn the Hutt, and so he was actually glad that Jabba had refused his offer to bargain, because he could then get his wish. While his primary objective was to rescue Han and protect his friends, the prospect of being able to kill Jabba too tinted Luke's purpose with a dark satisfaction. The fact that Luke so desperately wanted to kill Jabba and was happy that he would be able to really just blows my mind, because it seems so far off from what I would imagine Luke would do. But that's absolutely true to the story and the theme of Return of the Jedi, and they're just great details that really illustrate how Luke was very close to the dark side at that point in time. After the Battle of Endor in 4 ABY, Luke Skywalker would continue his quest to rebuild the Jedi Order, albeit at a slow pace. While Luke did continue training himself in the ways of the Jedi arts, it would not be until 7 years later, in 11 ABY, that he actually took the first steps towards finding his students and establishing a Jedi temple. So why did it take Luke several years to begin rebuilding the Order, when that seemed to be his primary mission once the Empire was destroyed? Why did he wait so long to search for the next generation of Jedi and begin teaching his own students? The simple answer is that he was afraid. But to understand why he was scared to begin, it's important to know about the conflicts that he was pulled into as the New Republic sought to replace the Galactic Empire. Conflicts that would instill that fear into him. These events are detailed in the Thrawn trilogy, the Dark Empire trilogy, and the Jedi Academy trilogy. By 9 ABY, the galaxy was still embroiled in conflict between the New Republic and various Imperial remnants still active as independent cells. When the terrifying Grand Admiral Thrawn reappeared, he did so with a mysterious new ally, the Dark Jedi Joruus C'baoth, who was truly an insane clone of a Jedi Master from the days of the Republic. Unaware of C'baoth's true nature, while the New Republic fought Thrawn, Luke went to meet with the Jedi Master. Luke hoped that C'baoth could continue his training, in the same way that Yoda had, but soon discovered that C'baoth was insane, and used the powers of the dark side as a dark Jedi. This revelation troubled Luke, and caused him to question the place of the Jedi in the galaxy as he witnessed C'baoth's rule as a tyrant over his subjects. C'baoth truly intended to corrupt both Luke and the pregnant Leia, enslaving them and Leia's unborn twins as his students of the dark side. While Luke did manage to escape with the help of Mara Jade, he would eventually be forced to confront C'baoth again in a final battle. When he did, he was shocked to discover that C'baoth had produced a clone from the hand that Luke had lost on Cloud City, and Luke had to engage his own insane clone in a duel. Doing so caused Luke to become incredibly troubled and unnerved, and confused about the sensation that emanated from his clone within the Force. Ultimately, both the insane clone of Luke and C'baoth were killed, and Thrawn's forces were defeated by the New Republic. These events would play a tremendous role in increasing Luke's reluctance to establish a new Jedi Order. However, it was nothing compared to what came next. In 11 ABY, the resurrected Emperor Palpatine attacked the New Republic, and Luke allowed himself to learn the ways of the dark side, experiencing its corruptive powers firsthand as the Emperor's apprentice. The destructive conflict that the dark side created within Luke almost consumed him, allowing him to understand the struggles that his father had endured when he became Darth Vader. It was only with the help and love of Leia and Han that Luke was redeemed, returning to the light side of the Force and defeating Palpatine's Dark Empire. Afterwards, Luke described the feeling of his heart as a diamond-hard lump, due to the experiences he had suffered through in those 7 years since the Battle of Endor. He had survived tests and struggles worse than anything his Jedi training had prepared him for, and by 11 ABY, he had proclaimed himself as the last remaining Jedi Master. He recognized that he understood more about the Force than he ever thought possible, and it terrified him. He thought of the young boy he had once been, learning of the Force from Obi-Wan aboard the Millennium Falcon, and trusting the Force to help him destroy the Death Star. Luke now understood why Obi-Wan's eyes had held such a weary and haunted look, as the burden of teaching students was undoubtedly overwhelming. However, Luke was forced to accept that the New Republic needed the aid of the Jedi Knights to maintain peace in the increasingly hostile galaxy, and it was time for him to train the next generation. Luke emphasized the importance of a new Jedi Order when he asked the Senate for permission to build an academy, yet his fear still remained. Most of all, Luke was afraid of the grim potential of the dark side, and that it may corrupt any students he took. He had now experienced the power of that darkness firsthand, and he was unsure if he was strong enough to keep his students safe from its grasp. The rest of the galaxy still remembered the reign of Darth Vader, and Luke wondered if a Jedi Master as wise and powerful as Obi-Wan could fail and lose Anakin to the dark side, how could Luke take the risk of training new Jedi? Luke questioned how many of his future students would fall to the dark side. How many enemies would he create by his own hand? Luke's fear was so powerful that it almost overwhelmed him, to the point that he contemplated if it was worth restoring the Jedi Order at all if the risk was the creation of a new Vader. He pondered the question seriously, but ultimately resolved that the galaxy needed to learn and grow from the terrible mistakes of the past. Luke realized that after he had fallen to and returned from the dark side, he was somewhat reborn, more powerful in the Force and more wary of the darkness than ever before. Luke's final decision, before beginning his search for students, was that even though the risk of darkness would always remain, he could not believe that the New Republic would be any safer without the Jedi Knights. When Luke Skywalker was attacked and captured by a terrifying Wampa on the ice world of Hoth, suffering permanent damage to his face, he was forced to rely on his unrefined powers in the Force to save himself. It had been 3 years since he had briefly trained with Obi-Wan Kenobi, and he still knew very little of the Force or how to wield its power. What Luke did have was raw strength, inherited from his father, which helped him call upon the Force to escape. This moment was always important to me because it's one of the first times that we ever saw Luke intentionally wield the Force with any sort of control. Even when he destroyed the Death Star, using the Force to guide the proton torpedoes, it was mostly an unconscious act where he surrendered to his instincts. In the lair of the Wampa, Luke used his powers to calm himself and summon his lightsaber, and his thoughts during the entire ordeal are explained beautifully in the novelization of The Empire Strikes Back. The book presents this moment as a very powerful and impactful experience for Luke as he feels the power of the Force. As the roars of the Wampa awakened him, Luke felt his head spinning, aching with pain where he had been struck by the creature. With painstaking effort, he brought his vision into focus, discerning that he was inside an ice gorge. He suddenly realized that he was hanging upside down, arms dangling and fingertips some 30 centimeters from the snowy ground. He craned his neck and saw that his feet were frozen in ice hanging from the ceiling, and his ankles had gone numb as the ice formed around his legs. He could feel the frozen mask of his own blood caked along his face where the Wampa had slashed him. Again, Luke heard the bestial moan, louder now as they resounded through the deep and narrow passageway of ice. He wondered what would kill him first, the cold or the fangs and claws of the monster that lurked nearby. He knew that he needed to free himself, but he could tell that his strength had not yet returned fully. He willed himself up and attempted to reach for his icy bonds, but was still too weak, quickly falling back into his hanging position. He told himself to relax. Again, the icy walls creaked with the loud bellows of the approaching Wampa. He could hear its massive feet crunching along the frozen ground, coming nearer. Luke's eyes darted around until he spotted the pile of gear he had brought with him on his scouting mission. It was nearly a full meter beyond his grasp, and he saw the device that entirely captured his attention. The lightsaber that had once belonged to his father, given to him by Obi-Wan so long ago. In desperation, Luke reached for the lightsaber, but the freezing cold coursing through his body slowed and weakened him with each passing second. He was beginning to resign himself to his fate as he heard the Wampa getting closer, and his last feelings of hope were nearly gone when he suddenly felt a presence. It was that soothing spiritual presence which occasionally visited Luke in moments of stress or danger. It had first come to him just after old Obi-Wan vanished into a crumple of his own dark robes after being cut down by Darth Vader. The presence was sometimes like a familiar voice, an almost silent whisper that spoke directly into Luke's mind. The voice told Luke to simply think of the lightsaber in his hand, and the words made his aching head throb even more. Then he felt a sudden resurgence of strength, a feeling of confidence that urged him to continue fighting despite his apparently hopeless situation. His eyes fixed on the lightsaber, and he reached his hand out painfully. He concentrated, telling himself to relax as he heard the presence remind him to let the Force flow through him. He stopped struggling for the weapon, and his body relaxed and went limp as he allowed his spirit to be receptive to his teacher's instruction. Already he could feel the energy field generated by all living things coursing through him. The Force bound the universe itself together, and at that moment, its power was within Luke to use as he saw fit. As the Wampa appeared, lumbering toward him, suddenly the lightsaber, as if by magic, sprang into Luke's hand. Instantly, he activated the blue blade and severed his icy bonds. As he dropped to the floor, weapon in hand, the monstrous figure of the Wampa sprang on him. Though it was difficult for him to move, Luke was open to the Force, and he swiftly struck with his saber, severing the creature's arm. As the Wampa roared in agony, he quickly fled the cave, tumbling out into the tundra. The sky was already noticeably darker, and with that encroaching darkness came increasingly colder winds. The Force was still with Luke, but even that mysterious power that he knew so little about could not warm him physically. Every step he took as he stumbled through the snow was more difficult than the last. Finally, his vision dimming faster than the daylight, he stumbled down an embankment of snow and was unconscious before he even reached the bottom. After losing his hand, his lightsaber, and learning the shocking truth that Darth Vader was his father, Luke Skywalker was left haunted by the ordeal. Recovering aboard the Millennium Falcon, he remained in a daze, overcome with shock at what Vader had told him. Luke told Leia that he had attempted to reach out to Obi-Wan with the Force, but didn't receive an answer. His emotional conflict had left his powers in the Force considerably weakened, confusing and frustrating him. He attempted to reach out to Yoda and became enraged when he heard no answer, cracking a window with the Force. Realizing that he was succumbing to his emotions, Luke began to question his path forward out of fear that Vader's claim of being his father was true. He questioned whether he should continue his Jedi training at all, and if Obi-Wan and Yoda still wanted him as their student. Later, while recovering from his injuries and adjusting to his new cybernetic hand, Luke was approached by Lando. Noticing that Luke was training with a blaster, Lando correctly determined that Luke's abilities in the Force were temporarily complicated, and attempted to persuade him to return to Cloud City. He offered to help Luke find his lost lightsaber if he would convince the rebel leaders to allow their trip. At the mention of his saber, Luke suddenly found himself subjected to a vision through the Force, where he saw a mysterious hooded figure catch the lightsaber as it fell. In the vision, Luke saw glimpses of the past, present, and future, and he saw the mysterious woman residing on an unknown yet distinctive planet. Luke believed that he needed to step away from the rebellion in order to follow the visions, and he thought the Force itself was sending him towards the mysterious woman. He wondered if she could be a Jedi, and could answer the questions that he held after fighting Vader. Using his description from the vision, R2 was able to identify the planet that Luke saw, learning it was called Sorelia. When they arrived, Luke wondered if it was possible that his lightsaber had ended up on this planet somehow, however unlikely that may be. He told R2 that whatever the Force wanted him to do on Sorelia, he would have to just let it happen. Landing near the coastline, they discovered a busy marina full of fishing boats at the piers. Luke spotted the woman that he believed he had seen in his vision, cautiously approaching her and introducing himself. He said that he thought the Force sent him to her, and hesitantly asked if she was a Jedi. Immediately, the mystery woman unloaded her catch of fish, dropping them onto Luke and fleeing in her speeder. Recovering from the diversion, Luke and R2 commandeered a speeder of their own and gave chase across the water. Luke actually enjoyed driving the aquatic speeder, since it was the complete opposite of his experiences on Tatooine. However, due to his inexperience, their speeder quickly capsized on a rogue wave, as the woman ran ashore and fled into a nearby cave. Luke and R2 surfaced in the water, swimming to shore as Luke remarked how much he loved sand. At the mouth of the cave, Luke was reminded of his trial in the Cave of Evil on Dagobah, and he cautiously wondered what could possibly be waiting for them inside, since he no longer had a lightsaber and he had just lost his blaster in the ocean. Taking a step inside, Luke accidentally activated a booby trap, pushing R2 out of the way with the Force just in time. Pressing onward, Luke relied on the Force to guide him, motivating himself by remembering his training with Yoda. He was successful in dodging other traps that lay in their path, until he leapt onto an unstable patch of ground, which crumbled and dropped him into a large pit. Metal bars snapped shut over the pit's opening, trapping Luke inside as bubbling water began to rush in from below. Wasting no time, Luke began attempting to hold back the rising water with the Force. As he did, trying to focus, the woman appeared above him, mocking his attempt to hold back the sea. As Luke strained with effort, she asked him what he wanted and why he had found her. Through gritted teeth, Luke explained again that he had seen her in a vision through the Force and that he was training to be a Jedi like her. She responded that she was not a Jedi, and anyone who wanted to be was a fool. Pressing a button on the wall, she deactivated the trap, causing the water to release as Luke slumped with exhaustion. Removing her hood, the woman complimented Luke on his strength in the Force, saying that he was obviously stronger than she was, and that she could sense he was telling the truth about his intentions. She introduced herself as Verla, and she mentioned Jedi hunters. Luke had never heard of any hunters before, which caused Verla to remark that he was more in over his head than she thought. Verla asked if he ever wondered why there weren't more Jedi in the galaxy, and she assumed that whoever had told Luke about the Jedi didn't mention the Inquisitors or the Jedi Purge. Solemnly, as if mourning the past, Verla told Luke how, at the end of the Clone Wars, Emperor Palpatine took control of the Republic and declared the entire Jedi Order to be traitors. Palpatine issued Order 66, and most Jedi, including Padawans and younglings, died that day in the Jedi Purge. She continued, explaining how powerful Darksiders known as the Inquisitorius were sent out to hunt Jedi survivors, and that they were led by Darth Vader. Distracted by her story, Verla didn't notice R2-D2 approach from behind, and he shocked her into unconsciousness and released Luke from the pit. Much later, she awoke to find herself restrained at a campfire as Luke cooked dinner. Luke introduced himself by his full name, and Verla recognized the name Skywalker, saying that she was aware that was Vader's name before he fell to the dark side. Almost desperately, Luke asked if she knew anything about Anakin. Verla explained that the Jedi Master Farron Barr had known that Anakin became Vader, and told her that Anakin was once a great hero of the Clone Wars, but she didn't know what caused him to become Vader. Focusing again on why he was there, Luke repeated that he saw Verla holding out a lightsaber to him in his vision, and asked if she had one that she was willing to give him. She replied that she didn't, but she did know where he could find one, before insisting that Luke didn't want to be a Jedi. She told Luke that she had been tasked with becoming a Jedi herself by Farron Barr, and she had spent most of her life running from Vader and the Inquisitors before deciding to abandon becoming a Jedi altogether. She warned Luke that the Force was a trap that chewed people up and used them for its own purposes, regardless of light or dark. Verla implored Luke to reconsider becoming a Jedi, insisting that he didn't need to do what the Force wanted him to do, and that the path he was on would tear him apart. While Luke assured her that he understood what she was saying, he reminded her that the galaxy was suffering, and that he needed to try to help no matter the danger. Realizing that Luke could not be deterred from the path of the Jedi, she sent him to an old outpost from the High Republic era located on the planet Tempest, and the two parted ways. Arriving on the stormy, lightning-covered planet Tempest, Luke and R2 made their way to the old Jedi outpost. Some of its spires were crumbled, yet it remained mostly intact, and Luke was able to open the doors with the Force as the symbol of the Jedi glowed brightly against the stone. Inside, Luke was shocked to see many relics of the past, like a holocron on a pedestal, temple guard armor, and crumbled statues of ancient masters. To his left, Luke noticed a lightsaber resting on another pedestal and claimed it, announcing that he would indeed become a Jedi with this new weapon. The interior of the outpost suddenly darkened around him as a flaming specter appeared behind him in the form of the Grand Inquisitor. Though killed long ago, the spirit somehow remained in the outpost. Luke had no idea who this figure was. As the Grand Inquisitor, still engulfed in ghostly flames, attacked, he gloated that he once served the Jedi, then he served Vader, and now he killed anyone who sprung the trap that Vader created. Luke, igniting the yellow saber that was now his, rebutted that he would never kill another Jedi again. The two engaged in a lightsaber duel, as the Grand Inquisitor taunted Luke's abilities and lack of training in the Force. Luke initially found himself overwhelmed, having no experience fighting against a double-bladed saber staff. As the fight continued, Luke drew upon the strength of the artifacts around him, the remnants of the lost Jedi Order, and gained the upper hand. Motivated by what he believed the Jedi once stood for, Luke was able to sever the Grand Inquisitor's hand and then slash the Spectre cleanly in half, causing him to dissipate in a shower of flames. Returning to the Rebel fleet, Luke told Leia that he had found what he was looking for and more. Leia asked him to show her and the other rebels whatever it was that he had found, as the rebellion itself was on the verge of extinction. Though he was hesitant at first, Luke listened to Leia's insistence, igniting his new saber before the crew, instilling hope and inspiring them to continue the fight against the Empire. After the fall of the Republic and the death of Padme Amidala, the Skywalker twins were hidden from their father, Darth Vader, and his Sith master, Emperor Palpatine. Obi-Wan Kenobi would spend the next 19 years in exile as Luke Skywalker's guardian on Tatooine. Obviously, Obi-Wan is known for bending the truth, sharing information from a certain point of view. When the time came for Luke to learn of the Jedi and the Force, as well as the truth about the Jedi that his father Anakin had once been, Obi-Wan withheld crucial details, avoiding the dark secret that Anakin had become Darth Vader. In the canon book Skywalker: A Family at War, Obi-Wan's reasoning for lying to Luke is explained, giving insight into his thoughts and why he thought it was in Luke's best interest that he be kept in the dark. At this time, Luke knew virtually nothing about the Jedi Order and the Force. His uncle had always been brusque when Luke started asking questions. However, in Obi-Wan he found a welcoming presence, someone who seemed willing to help satisfy his fascination with the past and his curiosity about the galaxy. In his solitude, Obi-Wan had come to a realization, a phrase he was fond of repeating: "The truth is often what we make of it." Perhaps it was just his own spin on one of his master, Qui-Gon Jinn's, favorite truisms: "Your focus determines your reality." Now in his late 50s, Obi-Wan was finally beginning to feel like he'd grown out of his youthful foolishness. Nearly as gray-haired and wrinkled as Yoda himself, he had made peace with some of the Jedi Order's folly and come to a reckoning of sorts. In all those years, he had imagined what answers he might give to Luke's curious probing one day. In the safety of his hut, Obi-Wan told Luke only what he believed the young man needed to know, the most basic facts as he saw them. Their conversation laid the foundation for Luke's initiation into the ways of the Jedi, while Obi-Wan continued to protect him, shielding him from the darkest aspects of his heritage. This was in accordance with ancient Jedi teaching. Disclosing the shocking truth of Luke's parentage, a revelation worthy of a Jedi trial, was best delayed until he became a full-fledged Jedi Knight. Thus, instead of revealing the truth, that day Obi-Wan hailed the Jedi Knight Anakin Skywalker as the best star pilot in the galaxy, a cunning warrior, and a loyal friend. And to win Luke's confidence, Obi-Wan offered his own failure to win the young man's trust. He admitted serving as the master of the future Sith Lord Darth Vader before he turned to evil and became a Jedi hunter. Factually, both statements were true, but he dared not connect the two identities. Obi-Wan simply said that Vader had betrayed and murdered Luke's father. An important detail to also add to this is that at this time, according to this book, Obi-Wan believed that Luke was the chosen one, and that the prophecy was misread, never referring to Anakin. This is also hinted at in Rebels when Obi-Wan tells Maul that Luke is the chosen one. If Luke was the chosen one, Obi-Wan knew he would have to vanquish Vader to restore balance to the Force, which is another reason that he did not tell Luke that Vader was Anakin. Shortly after the Battle of Yavin, Luke Skywalker joined Han, Leia, Chewbacca, and R2 and 3PO on a mission to infiltrate a weapons factory on Cymoon 1. To do so, the group hijacked the ship of an emissary sent by Jabba the Hutt to negotiate a weapons deal with the Imperials. Han replaced the emissary while Luke and Leia disguised themselves as bodyguards. Once inside the facility, they revealed themselves as rebels and made their way to the main power core. As they worked their way through the factory, Luke used what little knowledge of the Force he possessed, reaching out and sensing a disturbance. He stumbled upon a large force of caged slaves, as well as their captor. Quickly incapacitating the guard by severing his hand, Luke freed the slaves, introducing himself on behalf of the Rebel Alliance. He led them to a rendezvous with Han and Leia, announcing that he had a few more passengers for their escape. Just then, Chewbacca, stationed as a lookout outside, spotted another Imperial shuttle arriving. Stormtroopers outside the factory stood by to welcome the negotiator for the weapons deal, Darth Vader himself. Han ordered Chewie to stand down, not wanting to send the entire factory into high alert by attacking Vader. However, Leia ordered Chewie to take the shot if he could, insisting that nothing was more important than potentially killing Vader. As Vader proceeded towards the factory, he abruptly stopped, sensing the impending attack, and he easily blocked the blaster bolt with his saber as Chewie fired on him. To defend himself from the subsequent shots, Vader raised two stormtroopers above him with the Force as human shields. After dropping their dead bodies to the ground, Vader focused on Chewie, using the Force to topple the structure he was stationed in. Jumping to safety, Chewie began to flee as Vader instructed the remaining troopers to pursue him. Inside, the factory went into red alert as Han ordered 3PO to engage the Millennium Falcon's autopilot. They encountered stormtroopers right away, resulting in a brief firefight, pushing their way to an Imperial walker. As they prepared to hijack the walker, Leia realized that Luke was gone. Walking alone down a hallway, Luke heard the voice of Obi-Wan calling out to him through the Force. He told Obi-Wan that Vader was here and that he needed to face him. Luke still believed that Vader had killed Anakin Skywalker, and he sought revenge for Vader killing Obi-Wan on the Death Star. As Luke proceeded towards the Dark Lord, Obi-Wan's disembodied voice begged Luke to listen to him and run. As the two came face to face, Luke ignited his saber, and Vader mocked his obvious lack of training with the weapon.
You hold that weapon like an untrained child. You have no right to it. You, boy, are no Jedi.
Vader asked Luke who he was, and the boy simply replied that Vader had killed his father.
I've killed very many fathers. You'll have to be more specific.
Yelling out of anger, Luke lunged forward, engaging Vader in a duel as their blades clashed. Vader easily overpowered him, pushing him back onto his knees.
This is most pathetic. You are not worth the seconds it would take to finish you. Who sent you here to die like this?
Luke said that he was there on the Death Star when Vader killed his master, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Vader interrupted him by snatching his saber from his grasp with the Force.
So, Obi-Wan Kenobi gave you this lightsaber. A shame he did not teach you how to wield it. He never did make for much of a master. The Force will never be with you, boy. Your master has fallen. What hope have you? If you wish to live, you will tell me all you know of the rebellion, including the nature of this attack. And then you will lead me to the rebel pilot who destroyed the Death Star, and watch as I strike him down. Speak quickly, or join your father.
Luke refused Vader's commands, insisting that he would rather die than yield to him. Resigning to simply kill the boy, Vader crossed his arms, red and blue blades ready for the kill, very reminiscent of when Anakin Skywalker had executed Count Dooku. However, he was momentarily shocked as he realized what weapon he was holding.
Wait, this lightsaber. I know this weapon. This once belonged to...
Before he could finish his thought, the leg of an Imperial walker burst through the roof, separating Luke and Vader. Inside the walker, Han and Leia cleared a path for themselves and the slaves that Luke had freed, leading them outside the factory. As Luke joined the fray, he was horrified to see his lightsaber being used by Vader to kill the very slaves he had freed. As Luke tried to retrieve the saber from where Vader had thrown it, he begged Obi-Wan to help him, yet Vader called the weapon back to him before Luke could grab it. As Vader marched forward, he commanded his stormtroopers to kill all of the slaves, and Luke could do nothing but watch as they were brutally mowed down by blaster fire. As the battle continued, Luke found cover behind shipping containers, and he apologized to Obi-Wan, admitting that the entire battle was his fault. He lamented that he was not his father, he wasn't a Jedi, and he was only a farm boy from Tatooine that didn't belong in this fight. Snapping out of his moment of self-pity, Luke noticed several speeders to his left, realizing that perhaps his skills he had developed on Tatooine could help him. As Vader prepared to face the walker that Han and Leia had hijacked, Luke rode a speeder into the fight, taking out several troopers as Vader watched.
That boy. Perhaps I was too hasty to dismiss him. Just what have you been up to, Obi-Wan?
Interrupting his moment of admiration towards Luke, the leg of the walker slammed down next to him as Han and Leia attempted to crush Vader beneath it. However, Vader easily held the leg of the walker in place with the Force and began to crush the entire vehicle. Inside, Han stubbornly insisted that there was no such thing as the Force, and fired all 4 blaster cannons down at Vader, causing the Sith Lord to roar in anger as the ground exploded around him. With the walker barely functioning, they proceeded towards the Falcon, as Luke rode the speeder back into the battlefield to retrieve his lightsaber from where Vader had thrown it. Observing that there was no sign of Vader, Luke made his way towards the Falcon. Back on the battlefield, Vader emerged from a pile of rubble, uninjured yet without his helmet. Wheezing, Vader was approached by a stormtrooper, who was openly shocked at seeing the Dark Lord's scarred face. Without hesitation, Vader snapped the trooper's neck with the Force, summoning his fallen helmet as he commanded his troops to continue their pursuit of the rebels. He ordered them to leave the boy to him. As the battle continued and the rebels fought their way towards the Falcon, Luke rode through the enemy lines, slicing troopers and machinery with his saber. Vader made his way to Han and Leia's walker, quickly slicing the ankle couplings before they could realize what was happening. When Leia did see Vader, he was directly beneath them, out of reach of the cannons. Vader took the walker down, commanding his troops to move in for the kill. As Luke rushed to defend his friends, Han and Leia exited the wrecked walker, urging the slaves to flee to the nearby trash fields. As they made their way away from Vader, Luke stayed where he was, telling Leia that he couldn't just run away and let the fight be for nothing. As Luke sped back towards the factory, Vader ordered the stormtroopers to follow the other rebels into the trash fields, while he pursued Luke in a small ship. Luke plowed through the factory, firing on the power core and sending it into overload, dooming the entire facility. With Vader directly behind, Luke's speeder took several hits, and he spoke an apology to his father that he would never be the Jedi that he was, believing he was about to die. However, Luke was able to escape the factory a second before it exploded, leaving Vader behind in the damage. Vader, of course, emerged uninjured, just in time to see Luke and the other rebels escape on the Falcon.
The boy. The boy is your last great hope, isn't he, Obi-Wan? He is what you died to protect. He may be strong in the Force, but he is untrained. And who is there left to train him now? No one but me. When I find him, and I will find him, he will be my weapon, not yours. The dark side always wins, Obi-Wan. You should know that by now.
If you ask anyone to tell you what moment comes to mind when they think of Luke Skywalker, chances are they're going to pick this one. Arguably Luke's most iconic moment, this scene perfectly displays and cements his character, bringing us to the close of his arc that we followed throughout the course of the original trilogy. Not only that, in universe, this moment is also gargantuan in its importance. This is the moment that Luke Skywalker finally became a Jedi Knight. Return of the Jedi is not only the finale of the original Star Wars trilogy, it's also the end of Luke Skywalker's story as he goes on the traditional hero's journey. Mark Hamill even compared the story to showing the audience how James Bond got his license to kill. That's because Luke doesn't become a Jedi until the climax of the third film, and we follow him the entire way. But before we touch more on that specific moment, it's important to have an understanding of Luke's journey and what the central idea of Return of the Jedi is. One thing that symbolizes Luke's progression through his struggles and conflicts is, surprisingly and simply enough, his clothing. In the book The Star Wars Archives Volume 1, George Lucas explained how the colors of the world of Star Wars work, and how they specifically relate to Luke. George said, "The color was developed before Star Wars, when I was laying out the art direction, and so I just continued them throughout the other movies. When you're in the technical world, it's black and white. When you're in the organic world, it's sort of green and brown. One represents the dark side of the Force, the other represents the light side. Even more than that, the brown world represents human interaction, your psyche. The other represents machines, which means robots." Of course, Luke is coming out of the organic world, which is sand dunes, and he's moving into the technical world. He's sort of brown in a black and white world. As he goes on through the story, ultimately to confronting Vader, he's become, I wouldn't say a modern man, but a machine-oriented person as opposed to an organic person. To put it simply, based on what George said, the stages of Luke's progression through both the story of the trilogy and through the Force itself are symbolized in his clothing. In the first film, we're introduced to Luke in an all-white outfit, a young, idealistic farm boy that knows nothing of the world beyond the horizon of Tatooine. He knows nothing of the Force or the Jedi and the Sith. His white clothing represents that purity, that innocent ignorance he held before, in the words of Obi-Wan, taking his first steps into a larger world. By the events of The Empire Strikes Back, chronologically 3 years later, Luke's world is flipped upside down, figuratively and literally. As the world around him gets darker, with the Empire tightening its grip on the fragmented Rebel Alliance and the uncertain weight of his destiny resting on Luke's shoulders as he learns more of the Force, his clothing gets darker as well. He spends the latter portion of the film wearing a grayish tan jumpsuit, which gets progressively dirtier and damaged during his confrontation with Darth Vader on Cloud City. Empire specifically does a great job of making the world of Star Wars murkier, almost polluted, as the story creates tension and uncertainty about where Luke's journey could take him. George Lucas purposefully included Yoda's line about another last hope for the galaxy to suggest to the audience that Luke could be killed by the end of the film. When you think about Luke's actions during Empire, that doesn't seem too implausible, given that his impulsiveness and poor decisions continuously cause him to fail throughout the entire thing. In short, Luke's gray clothing embodies all of that dark uncertainty throughout Empire. As he grows stronger in the Force and trains with Yoda, he also steps ever closer to the dark side, which is what's perfectly portrayed when we next find him in Return of the Jedi. In the same book, The Star Wars Archives Volume 1, George explained that he decided to dress Luke in black for the third film not only to symbolize where he stood in his journey, but so that he would simply look like Darth Vader. But Luke doesn't only look like Darth Vader when we see him ominously enter Jabba's palace. He acts like Vader too, subtly choking the guards and delivering some threatening lines across the next several scenes. This is all completely intentional. The crux of Luke's situation in Return of the Jedi is him confronting and dealing with the dark side of the Force, first and foremost within himself, which is why he wears black. Thus, you can see the gradual degrading of Luke's clothing as he progresses in his journey with the Force, from white to gray to black. As with Empire's uncertainty about whether Luke would survive, Jedi questions whether or not Luke will remain good or turn to the dark side at the end. The latter alternative was something considered by George and even advocated for by Mark Hamill. The possibility of Luke following his father's dark footsteps was even foreshadowed in Empire. His black outfit, his slightly arrogant remarks about his power, and his violent threats to Jabba all seem to suggest that Luke is even closer to becoming Vader than we ever thought he could be. The concept of becoming Vader is absolutely central to the moment where Luke finds himself pushed into a rage he cannot control aboard the second Death Star. Goaded into a frenzy by Vader and motivated by his desire to protect Leia, Luke truly unleashes his anger for the first time, seemingly giving into the dark side. While he is still essentially staying true to his character by trying to protect Leia, he's doing it in the wrong way, giving into anger and hatred, playing right into the Emperor's hands as he nearly makes the same mistakes his father did. As Luke stood over Vader, the battered Sith Lord at his mercy, he found himself in the same situation that his father had been in, with Count Dooku at his mercy. The only difference is, Anakin said yes, and Luke says no. Looking down at Vader, Luke realizes the trap he has nearly fallen into, walking the same evil path that his father had and making the same mistakes, a possible fate that he had seen before in the Cave of Evil. Luke realizes then that by destroying Vader, he would become Vader. With that realization, he chooses to implement the Jedi teachings, fulfilling Yoda's decree that facing Vader again would be the final trial of his training. Displaying the optimism and compassion central to his character, Luke decides to spare his father's life and discards his lightsaber, perfectly embodying Yoda's lesson that a Jedi uses the Force for knowledge and defense, never for attack. In front of his mortal enemy, the reigning Sith Master in Darth Bane's line of Dark Lords, Luke Skywalker surrendered to the will of the Force, refusing to fight out of anger or hatred, refusing the dark side, refusing the machinations of the Sith. He decided to be a peacekeeper, a servant of the light, a Jedi Knight. Over the course of the movie, Luke's friends and even his masters had refused to grant him the title of Jedi Knight. Han accused him of suffering delusions of grandeur, and Yoda reminded him that even though his training was complete, he would not be a Jedi until he confronted Darth Vader again. In the moment that Luke refused to take his father's life, it was the Emperor, a Sith Lord, that finally granted him the title, cementing that as the moment that Luke Skywalker finally became a Jedi.
So be it, Jedi.
To further hammer in this point, returning to the symbolism of his clothing in his journey, the flap of Luke's tunic comes loose, opening to reveal white underneath. This was intentional, as it was meant to symbolize that the light was always inside of him. Thank you guys for watching this compilation. If you made it all the way to the end, I really appreciate it. So make sure to like and subscribe if you did enjoy it, and may the Force be with you.